The scent of time was the only perfume Ilara Vance had ever known. It clung to her clothes, her skin, her hair, a dry, sweet fragrance of decaying paper, cracked leather, and the faint, acidic bite of binding glue. At 22, her world was confined to the four walls of a dusty workshop, a forgotten alcove tucked away from the city's relentless pulse. Here she was a priestess of the past, her slender fingers moving with a surgeon's precision to mend the broken spines and torn pages of other people's stories. She breathed life back into forgotten narratives, her own life held in a state of suspended animation. The motes of dust dancing in the single beam of afternoon light were her only companions, silent witnesses to a youth spent in service to memory, while her own future remained a blank, unwritten page, growing more brittle with each passing day. If you wish to discover the impossible price she must pay to write her own story, a chapter written in sacrifice and desperation, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you are watching from. We continue. Ilara Vance was a study in quiet contradictions. Her eyes, the color of faded denim, held a depth of emotion that rarely surfaced, guarded by a shy, almost apologetic posture. She moved through her workshop with a practiced grace, her hands the most expressive part of her. They were not the delicate hands of a girl her age. They were tools, calloused at the tips, stained with ink, yet capable of the most intricate work, of suturing a page so perfectly the wound became invisible. This meticulous care she lavished on inanimate objects was a displaced form of the love that consumed her entire being, a devotion so absolute it had built a fortress around her heart, leaving no room for the careless explorations of youth, no space for the touch of another, and no possibility for a story of her own to begin. The reason for her gilded cage had a name, Lily. Her younger sister was the sun around which Ilara's world revolved, a sun that was slowly, inexorably dimming. Lily's illness, a rare degenerative condition, was a thief that stole not just her strength but the family's finances, their peace, and Ilara's future. Every penny Ilara earned from her painstaking labor went toward the towering medical bills, a constant, crushing weight that dictated every choice she made. She was not just a sister, she was a guardian, a provider, a sentinel standing watch over a flickering flame. The sacrifice of her own youth was not a conscious decision, but a slow, silent erosion, a shoreline giving way to a relentless tide of necessity and love, a love so fierce it bordered on a beautiful, tragic form of self-immolation. Her innocence, therefore, was not a virtue she cherished, but a consequence she endured. Ilara was a virgin not from moral conviction or religious decree, but from a life lived in the trenches of a quiet war. The boys who had once shown interest were met with a polite, impenetrable wall of distraction. There was no time for coffee dates when Lily had a doctor's appointment, no emotional energy for flirtation when her mind was consumed with calculating pharmacy costs. The very concept of desire felt like a foreign language she'd never had the opportunity to learn. It was a luxury, a frivolous expense in an emotional economy where every asset was already allocated to her sister's survival. Her body was an unread book, its pages still bound together, waiting for a reader who would never arrive because she was too busy preserving the library for someone else. The workshop itself was a physical manifestation of her soul. It was a sanctuary, a place where the chaos of hospital waiting rooms and the terror of medical prognoses could be held at bay by the methodical, calming ritual of her work. But it was also a prison. The towering shelves of books, filled with grand adventures, epic romances, and tales of rebellion, were a constant, silent mockery of her own static existence. She was the keeper of 1,000 lives, but a ghost in her own. The very air, thick with the dust of ages, seemed to represent the years of her own life settling, unlived and unnoticed. Each restored book she sent back into the world felt like a small act of hope, a vicarious participation in a life of meaning, even as her own felt increasingly hollow. From her window she watched the world move on without her. Girls her age laughed as they walked by, their arms linked, their futures bright and full of possibility. They spoke of careers, of travel, of love and heartbreak, the mundane, beautiful fabric of a normal life. For Ilara, these scenes were like watching a film in a language she couldn't understand. A chasm of experience separated her from them, a gap carved out by responsibility and fear. A gnawing powerlessness was her constant companion, the cold dread that no matter how hard she worked, how much she sacrificed, it would never be enough. Her love was a vast, bottomless ocean, but she was terrified that it was all she had to offer against an incurable storm, and she was beginning to drown in it. One evening, as the city lights began to glitter like scattered jewels outside her window, she finished her work on a first edition of a classic romance. The gold-leaf title gleamed under her lamp, promising a story of passion, trials, and ultimate triumph. She ran her thumb over the embossed letters, a familiar ache blooming in her chest. The story within the book was complete, its ending secure and satisfying. Her own story, however, felt like a prologue that never ended, a perpetual state of waiting for a narrative to begin. The silence of the workshop pressed in on her, no longer comforting but suffocating. She could feel the delicate threads of her carefully constructed world beginning to fray, sensing that the immense weight of her love and sacrifice was about to force her to turn a page she never, ever wanted to read. The city where Alara lived was a beast of concrete and glass, its heartbeat a constant, indifferent hum that never reached her quiet corner. Her daily commute was a journey across invisible borders, from the crumbling brick facades and rain-slicked streets of her neighborhood to the polished marble lobbies of the financial district where her workshop was a forgotten relic. She would sit on the bus, a ghost among the living, watching the city's affluent citizens stride purposefully toward lives she could only imagine. For them, the city was a ladder of opportunity. For her, it was a maze with no exit, its towering skyscrapers casting long, oppressive shadows that seemed to follow her home, reminding her of the vast, unbridgeable distance between her world of silent sacrifice and their world of casual, effortless existence. She was a native of this place, yet she felt like a tourist in her own life. Her home was a small second-floor apartment that always smelled faintly of her mother's anxiety and the antiseptic cleaner used for Lily's medical equipment. It was a space defined by what it lacked: room to breathe, privacy, and silence. Every piece of furniture was worn but meticulously cared for, a testament to her mother's pride and their precarious financial state. The walls were thin, carrying the sounds of neighbors, arguments, and the distant wail of sirens, a constant soundtrack to their quiet desperation. The true heart of the apartment was the small kitchen table, where a formidable stack of white and pink envelopes, medical bills, final notices, insurance denials, sat like a monument to their failure. This pile was the family's true patriarch, a silent, demanding tyrant that dictated their every meal, their every word, and Ilara's every waking thought. Mrs. Vance, Ilara's mother, moved through the cramped apartment like a ghost haunted by the future. A woman who had once been vibrant, she was now whittled down by worry, her love for her daughters calcified into a brittle, suffocating fear. She clung to tradition as if it were a life raft, her conversations with Ilara often circling back to the daughters of friends who had married well. It wasn't malicious. It was a desperate prayer. In her mind, a good husband for Ilara was not a source of happiness but a solution, a financial lifeline. She saw Ilara's quiet beauty and gentle nature as assets to be bartered for security, never once considering the possibility that her daughter might harbor desires of her own. Her constant, worried glances were heavier than any spoken criticism, a silent pressure that made Ilara feel like a commodity whose value was depreciating daily. The rhythm of Ilara's life was a merciless metronome, ticking away the seconds of her youth with brutal consistency. Her days were not her own. They were a series of duties, a litany of tasks performed on behalf of others. She woke before dawn to the soft beep of Lily's infusion pump, her first conscious act to measure out medications. The hours at the workshop, which should have been a reprieve, were spent with her mind racing, calculating expenses, worrying about a new symptom Lily had mentioned. The bus ride home was a descent back into the tense quiet of the apartment, followed by an evening of tending to her sister, coaxing her to eat, reading to her until she fell into a restless sleep. Only then, in the deep silence of the night, did Ilara have a moment to herself, but she was usually too exhausted to do anything but stare at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the next identical day already pressing down on her. There were moments, sharp and painful, when the life she wasn't living broke through the gray monotony of her own. Standing at the bus stop, she would watch a group of young women spill out of a nearby cafe, their laughter echoing in the evening air. They spoke of weekend plans, of difficult professors, of a boy who had texted them. Their concerns seemed so beautifully, impossibly trivial. In those moments, a bitter envy would rise in Alara's throat, hot and shameful. She would quickly crush it down, replacing it with a wave of guilt. How could she begrudge them their happiness when Lily was fighting for every breath? This constant cycle of longing followed by self-reproach was its own form of torture, a secret punishment she inflicted upon herself for the crime of wanting a life that was solely her own, a life she felt she had no right to even dream about. The pressure valve tightened with the arrival of a thick, cream-colored envelope from the hospital's administrative office. It wasn't another bill, but something worse. A formal letter outlining the costs for the new experimental treatment that was Lily's last hope. Alara watched her mother's hands tremble as she read it, her face crumbling as she absorbed the string of zeros that followed the dollar sign. The figure was astronomical, a sum that felt more like a cruel joke than a real number. Her mother began to weep silently, a sound of utter defeat that pierced Alara's heart. In that moment, Alara felt a strange and terrifying calm settle over her. She took the letter from her mother's hands, her own fingers steady. The helplessness that had defined her life was beginning to curdle into something else, something harder and more dangerous. A cold, stark resolve. The world had given her an impossible problem, and her mind was beginning to search for an impossible solution. Evenings with Lily were a delicate balance of profound love and suffocating sorrow. Her sister's room was the one bright spot in the apartment, decorated with fairy lights and drawings, a small haven against the encroaching darkness of her illness. Lily, despite her physical frailty, possessed a sharp and curious mind. "Did you see anyone interesting today, Alara?" she would ask, her voice a soft whisper. "Did that handsome man with the gray coat come back to the shop?" Alara would invent small, harmless stories for her, tales of clumsy customers and funny encounters, weaving a fiction of a life that was far more engaging than her own. These moments were precious, yet they were also a blade twisting in her gut. She was her sister's window to a world she was no longer part of, a world Alara herself was only pretending to inhabit. Each smile she coaxed from Lily felt like a lie that deepened her own isolation. The unspoken moral code of their neighborhood was as tangible as the bricks in the buildings. It was a place where reputations were built on piety and sacrifice, especially for women. A daughter's worth was measured by her devotion to her family, her purity, and her ability to secure a respectable future through marriage. Mrs. Vance, a product of this environment, would often sigh about Alara's lack of prospects, her voice laced with a fear of community judgment. "You are a good girl, Alara," she would say, the words intended as a compliment but landing like a sentence. "But goodness doesn't pay the bills." This sentiment echoed in Alara's mind, twisting the very nature of her sacrifice. Her innocence, her self-denial, the very qualities her mother praised as virtuous, were also being framed as a liability, an obstacle to their survival. She was trapped in a paradox. She was expected to be pure, yet her purity was becoming worthless in the face of their crushing debt. The workshop, once her sanctuary, was beginning to feel like a hall of mirrors, each book reflecting a different version of a life she would never lead. As she carefully stitched the spine of an old atlas, her fingers tracing the faded lines of faraway countries, a profound sense of being stationary washed over her. She was a restorer of journeys, a preserver of adventures, yet her own feet were cemented to this small patch of the city. The epic romances she mended felt like a personal affront, their declarations of all-consuming love, a mockery of her own empty, untouched existence. The dust motes dancing in the light no longer seemed like companions, but like the ashes of her own incinerated youth. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was the sound of her future being erased, one quiet, lonely day at a time. The very craft that gave her purpose was now a source of exquisite pain. Late one night, long after her mother and sister were asleep, Alara sat at the kitchen table, the letter from the hospital spread out before her like a death sentence. The city's distant glow seeped through the window, illuminating the stark, unforgiving numbers on the page. She traced the final figure with her finger, feeling nothing but a vast, hollow emptiness. Love was not enough. Hard work was not enough. Her quiet, virtuous sacrifice was not enough. They were all currencies in a world that only valued cash. A desperate, terrifying thought, one she had pushed away for weeks, now rose to the surface, fully formed and unavoidable. It was an idea born not of desire but of pure, cold calculation. She had one asset left, one thing of value in a world of transactions. It was the one part of herself she had kept untouched, preserved not for love, but, as it turned out, for a price. Damian Blackwood existed in a state of suspended animation, a self-imposed exile in a fortress of glass and steel that pierced the clouds. His penthouse was less a home and more a mausoleum for a man who had died long ago, leaving only a ghost obsessed with control. Known in the hushed, fearful circles of high finance as the architect of ruin, he was a predator who moved with a chilling, surgical precision, dismantling empires for profit. He collected art not for its beauty, but for its value, and he engaged with people not for connection, but for leverage. The city lights glittered below him like a treasure he owned but could not feel, each point of light, a life he could influence but never join. His world was a sterile, silent vacuum, meticulously designed to keep the messiness of human emotion at a permanent, unbreachable distance, a kingdom built on the ashes of his own belief in anything pure. The source of this profound cynicism was a wound that never healed, a betrayal that had carved out his core and replaced it with ice. Years ago, he had loved with the reckless abandon of a man who believed in forever, only to discover that the object of his devotion was a master manipulator, her perceived innocence a meticulously crafted illusion designed to ruin him. The experience had been a crucible, burning away his naivete and forging a new, unbreakable creed. Everything and everyone had a price. Love was a transaction, connection was a liability, and purity was a myth. Now he sought not to recapture that lost innocence, but to conquer it, to purchase it in its most untainted form, and prove to the ghost of his younger self that his current, cold reality was the only truth. This was not about pleasure, it was an exorcism. The call from the broker was as impersonal as a stock market update. A new asset had become available, unique and rare. The description was brief, clinical, female, 22, verifiably untouched, motivated by family medical debt. For Damian, the words registered not as a human story, but as a set of perfect, desirable specifications. It was the ultimate acquisition, a chance to own the very concept that had destroyed him. He agreed to the exorbitant price without a moment's hesitation, the number a meaningless abstraction to him. As he hung up the phone, he felt no flicker of excitement or lust, only the cold, satisfying click of a final puzzle piece falling into place. He would conduct this transaction with the same detached precision he applied to a corporate takeover, expecting a simple, clean, and ultimately empty victory that would reaffirm his desolate worldview. Alara's journey to him was a slow, terrifying ascent into another reality. The taxi ride through the gleaming, sterile canyons of the financial district felt like a passage to the underworld. The lobby of his building was a cavern of polished marble and silent, judgmental emptiness, a place so quiet she could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. A stoic man in a severe suit guided her to a private elevator without a word, his silence more intimidating than any threat. As the elevator shot upward with dizzying, silent speed, the city fell away beneath her. She stared at her reflection in the mirrored walls, a frightened girl in a worn but clean coat, her face pale, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it felt like a physical illness. She was a fragile, paper-bound book being delivered into the hands of a man who only knew how to break spines. The elevator doors slid open not into a hallway, but directly into the heart of the void. The penthouse was a vast expanse of white floors, black furniture, and glass walls that showcased the sprawling, indifferent city. And there, standing in the center of it all, was him. Damian Blackwood was not a man, but a statue carved from shadow and ice. He was tall, dressed in a simple dark sweater and trousers that did nothing to hide the coiled power in his frame. His stillness was absolute, a predator's patient waiting. He didn't move as she stepped hesitantly out of the elevator, his eyes, a startling, piercing gray, fixing on her instantly. They were not cruel, not angry. but something far worse. They were utterly devoid of emotion, the eyes of a man looking at an object he had just purchased, and in that single, assessing gaze, Elara felt every ounce of her humanity begin to evaporate. He watched her for a long, suffocating moment, his head tilted slightly, as if examining a piece of art for flaws. He took in her cheap coat, the nervous way her hands were clenched together, the faint tremor in her lip she was trying so desperately to control. This was not the calculated poise of a woman selling a commodity. This was the raw, unvarnished fear of a sacrificial lamb. A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or a disquieting sense of miscalculation, crossed his features before being suppressed. He had paid for a concept, an idea of untainted purity, but what stood before him was a terrified girl, her sacrifice a palpable, heavy presence in his sterile air. The transaction was already becoming messy, contaminated by the very human emotion he had paid a fortune to avoid. He had wanted a symbol, and the universe had sent him a soul. "You are Elara Vance," he said. It was not a question, but a statement of ownership. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, smooth and controlled, yet it seemed to absorb all the warmth from the room. The sound of her own name in his mouth felt like a violation, a branding. She could only manage a single, jerky nod, her throat too tight to form words. She felt pinned by his gaze, a butterfly under glass, her every nervous tick and shallow breath catalogued and analyzed. He took a slow step toward her, and she flinched, an involuntary recoil that was impossible to hide. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. The fear was real. He had expected compliance, perhaps even a feigned shyness. But this raw, animal terror was an unplanned variable, and Damian Blackwood did not tolerate unplanned variables. As he closed the distance between them, his gaze dropped from her face to her hands. He saw them then, the faint bluish stains of ink deep in the cuticles, the small calloused pads on her fingertips. These were not the hands of an object of fantasy. They were the hands of a worker, a creator, a restorer. They told a story of labor and dedication, a narrative completely at odds with the sterile commercial act about to take place. For a split second, the image of the broker's cold description was shattered by the reality of these hands. They spoke of a life of meticulous care, of mending broken things, a life of purpose that his money was about to irrevocably shatter. It was a detail so small, so insignificant, yet it pricked at the edge of his conscience, a tiny, unwelcome intrusion of a world he had long since abandoned. Elara forced herself to meet his eyes, a desperate act of self-preservation, a refusal to completely disappear, and in that moment, looking past the cold, impenetrable mask of power, she saw it. It was a flicker, a brief, unguarded glimpse into the vast, desolate emptiness behind his gaze. It wasn't cruelty she saw, but a loneliness so profound, so absolute, that it seemed to echo her own. He was a prisoner in his perfect glass cage, just as she was a prisoner of her desperate love for Lily. They were two sides of the same coin of isolation, separated by a chasm of wealth but united by a shared, unspoken brokenness. The realization did not comfort her. It terrified her more than anything. To see a sliver of humanity in the monster was a complication her heart could not afford, a dangerous seed of fascination planted in the barren soil of her fear. He stopped just a few feet from her, the space between them crackling with a tension that was thick and suffocating. The scent of him, something clean and cold, like winter air and expensive soap, reached her, an intimate detail that felt like an assault. He lifted a hand, not to touch her, but to gesture toward the sprawling living area behind him, a silent command to follow. "Come," he said, the single word an indisputable order. The faint, almost imperceptible softening she thought she saw in his eyes was gone, replaced once more by the cool, detached assessment of a buyer. As she took a hesitant step forward, crossing the invisible threshold into his world, she knew this was the true point of no return. She was no longer just selling a part of herself. She was entering the orbit of a man whose darkness threatened to consume what little light she had left. She followed him through the vast, silent expanse of the penthouse, her footsteps swallowed by the plush, sound-dampening rugs. The space was an architectural marvel of cold precision, a symphony in chrome, glass, and stark white marble. There were no photographs, no sentimental clutter, no sign that a human being actually lived here. It was a gallery curated to display wealth and power, and she was its newest, most fragile acquisition. He moved through it with a predator's easy ownership, his presence a dark, solid mass against the glittering backdrop of the city lights. Each step she took felt like a surrender, a forfeiture of another piece of herself to the sterile, airless void of his world. She clutched the strap of her worn handbag as if it were a life raft, the only familiar texture in an ocean of intimidating perfection, her own worn reality, a stark contrast to his flawless facade. He stopped before a sleek black bar and gestured toward the array of crystal decanters. "A drink?" he offered, his voice a flat, toneless instrument that betrayed no warmth or hospitality. It was not a gesture of kindness, but a formality, another step in a cold, predetermined process. Elara shook her head, a small, tight movement. "No, thank you." The words were barely a whisper, but in the crushing silence of the room, they felt like a shout of defiance. She needed her fear sharp and undiluted, a shield to keep her from shattering completely. A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed his features. He was a man accustomed to compliance, to a world that bent to his will. Her simple refusal was a tiny, unexpected snag in the fabric of his control, a quiet assertion that, while he might have bought her presence, he did not yet own her will. Without another word, he turned and led her toward a different room. Her heart sank as she realized it was a library, but it was unlike any she had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were filled with pristine, leather-bound volumes, arranged not by author or subject, but by color and size, a perfect, soulless aesthetic. There was no comfortable chair for reading, no scent of aging paper, only the cold, chemical smell of preservation. It was a collection, not a sanctuary. This was the ultimate violation. He had taken the one thing she loved, the world she understood, and rendered it sterile and meaningless. She, a woman who mended the souls of books, was now standing in a graveyard of them, a testament to a man who collected stories but had clearly forgotten how to feel one, and she was to be his next unread volume. He pulled a rare, first-edition volume from the shelf, his movements economical and precise. He didn't open it, he simply held it, an object of value. "The broker mentioned your profession," he stated, his piercing gray eyes fixing on her. "You restore things." The observation hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He was the architect of ruin, and she was a mender of what was broken. The cosmic irony was not lost on her. She found her voice, a small, reedy thing. "I try to save them," she corrected softly. "Books have lives. They carry the memories of everyone who has ever touched them. My job is to make sure those memories aren't lost." As she spoke of her work, a flicker of her true self, the careful artisan, broke through the terror, a brief, defiant spark in the oppressive darkness of his presence. Damien's mouth tightened into a thin, dismissive line. He placed the book back on the shelf with a soft, final thud. "A sentimental notion," he said, his voice laced with a cold cynicism that chilled her to the bone. "Memories are liabilities. Attachments are weaknesses. You are preserving ghosts for a world that has no use for them." His words were a deliberate cruelty, designed to strip her of her dignity, to reduce her passion to a pathetic, outdated folly. But Elara heard something else beneath the venom. She heard the profound, aching bitterness of a man who had once believed in those very ghosts, a man so deeply wounded by a memory that he had declared war on the entire concept. His attempt to belittle her had inadvertently revealed the source of his own profound brokenness, the hollow space where his own attachments used to be. The days that followed were a unique form of torture. He did not complete the transaction. Instead, he summoned her to the penthouse again, and then again. There was no explanation, just a car sent to her apartment, a silent, non-negotiable command. Each journey was a fresh wave of dread, and a confusing, traitorous flutter of anticipation. He seemed to be studying her, observing her as one might a complex, unpredictable specimen. He would have her sit in silence while he worked, the only sound the soft clicking of his keyboard. He was a man who paid for control, yet he was inexplicably delaying the very act that would grant it to him. For Ilara, this limbo was worse than the act itself. She was being unraveled slowly, her fear becoming entangled with a dangerous, unwanted curiosity about the man who held her future in his hands. During one of these strange silent vigils, he broke the quiet without looking up from his laptop. "Tell me about her," he commanded. The question was so unexpected it took Ilara a moment to understand. "Lily." He was asking about Lily. Her throat constricted. She spoke of her sister in hesitant, fractured sentences, describing her wit, her love for silly movies, the way she could light up a room with a weak smile. She did not speak of the illness, but of the person. As she talked, she felt the sterile air of the penthouse become charged with the warmth of her love for her sister. Damien remained silent, his fingers stilled over the keyboard. He was not just listening, he was absorbing her words, and for the first time, the transaction between them felt contaminated by something real, something human he hadn't accounted for, the purity of her sacrifice. In that moment, watching his unreadable expression as she spoke of her sister, Ilara saw the full depth of his isolation. He had built his fortress of wealth to protect himself from the very thing she was describing. A love so powerful it demanded absolute vulnerability, a connection that could bring both salvation and ruin. Her devotion to Lily was a language he had forgotten how to speak, and it fascinated and repelled him in equal measure. A strange, unwanted empathy began to bloom in her chest, a dangerous weed in the barren soil of their arrangement. She was beginning to see past the monster, past the cold-hearted billionaire, to the lonely, barricaded man within. This realization terrified her, because pity was a form of connection, and connection was a luxury she could not afford. It was a betrayal not just of herself, but of the cold, hard reason she was here. This nascent empathy began to curdle into something more complex, something she refused to name. She found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the way he would stare out at the city as if searching for something that wasn't there. A traitorous thought entered her mind. She wanted to soothe that tension, to understand the source of that profound loneliness. This was the desire she had spent her entire life avoiding. Not the simple physical curiosity of youth, but a deeper, more perilous longing to connect with another person's pain. It was a restorer's impulse, the instinct to see something broken and want to make it whole. The thought was so shameful, so contrary to her purpose, that she felt a wave of self-loathing wash over her. She was here to save Lily, not to fix her captor. The fragile truce of their silent meetings shattered over something as simple as a glass of water. She had reached for the carafe on the low table between them at the same moment he did. His fingers brushed against hers, a brief, fleeting contact, but the effect was like a bolt of lightning in the still room. A jolt of pure, unadulterated heat shot up her arm, and she snatched her hand back as if she'd been burned. He did the same, his face a mask of shock, his cool composure finally cracking. The air between them thickened, vibrating with a sudden, undeniable charge. The unspoken had become physical, a silent acknowledgement of the magnetic pull that had been growing in the space between them, a force that defied the cold logic of their contract and terrified them both with its raw, untamable power. His recovery was immediate and brutal. His eyes, which for a moment had shown surprise, turned to chips of ice. "Do not forget why you are here, Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "This is not a social call. You are a commodity I have purchased, nothing more." The words were like a slap, designed to wound, to re-establish the brutal reality of their situation, and erase the intimacy of the moment before. He was angry, but she could see it was an anger born of fear. He was furious with her for making him feel something, for breaching the walls he had spent years constructing. He was trying to force the situation back into the clean, simple lines of a business deal, but the touch had already happened. The line had been crossed, and his cruelty only served to highlight how deeply it had affected him. The sting of his words was sharper than she could have ever anticipated. It wasn't the insult that hurt, but the truth she had been trying to deny. She was a commodity. But in the strange, suspended reality of their meetings, she had started to feel like something else. She had started to feel seen. His cold dismissal shattered that illusion, leaving her exposed and ashamed. The dilemma that had been a dull ache in her chest now became a searing, agonizing pain. She had come here to sacrifice her body for Lily, a clean if terrible transaction. But now her heart was involved, her emotions entangled with a man who saw her as nothing more than an object. She was caught between her duty to her sister and the horrifying, burgeoning desire for the kindness of the very man who was paying to destroy a part of her. Their next meeting was thick with a suffocating tension. He avoided looking at her, keeping his focus on paperwork, his posture rigid and unyielding. But she could feel his awareness of her in the room. It was a palpable presence, a magnetic field that made it difficult to breathe. He was fighting a war with himself, and she was the battlefield. He had sought to purchase innocence to prove its corruptibility, to confirm his own cynical worldview. But her quiet resilience, her profound capacity for love, and her unexpected ability to see the cracks in his armor were challenging his entire belief system. He was a predator who had captured his prey, only to find himself mesmerized by the beating of its heart, unwilling and unable to deliver the killing blow he had so carefully planned. Gathering a reserve of courage she didn't know she possessed, Elara broke the silence. Her voice, though trembling, was clear. "Why me?" she asked. The question was a direct challenge to his carefully constructed detachment. She was refusing to be a nameless, faceless concept of purity. She was demanding to be seen as a person, to understand the motive behind her own sacrifice from the man who had orchestrated it. For a moment she thought he would ignore her, or worse, punish her for her audacity. He slowly lifted his head, his gray eyes locking onto hers, and in their depths she saw not anger, but a flicker of something that looked like cornered desperation. She had forced him to confront the human being sitting across from him, and the weight of that reality was beginning to crush him. "Because you were supposed to be simple," he finally answered, the words sounding torn from him. "A clean transaction, an idea, not a complication." He spoke of purity and finality, of exorcising old ghosts, but his gaze never left her face. He was no longer talking about a concept. He was talking about her. His intellectual justification for this cold, calculated act was dissolving in the face of her tangible presence. He had wanted to buy a ghost, but instead he had summoned a soul, and its light was beginning to illuminate the darkest, most desolate corners of his own. The confession, though couched in anger, was an admission of his own failure to remain detached. He was involved, enmeshed against his will, and he was just as trapped in this as she was. The invisible barrier between them finally disintegrated. He rose from his chair and crossed the room, his movements no longer controlled and precise but charged with a raw, undeniable urgency. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. The air crackled, thick with everything they hadn't said, with the profound loneliness that defined him, and the lifetime of repression that defined her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror, and a wild, soaring hope she had no right to feel. This was it. The precipice. The moment where the cold contract would be consumed by the fire of a connection neither of them had ever wanted but could no longer deny. He stood before her, his mask of cold indifference completely shattered, revealing the desperate, starving man beneath. His gaze was no longer that of a buyer assessing an asset. It was a plea, a question, a confession, all at once. Slowly, as if moving against a powerful current, he raised his hand. His fingers, she noticed with a jolt, were trembling almost imperceptibly. He didn't touch her skin. Instead, with a shocking, breathtaking tenderness, he gently tucked a stray strand of her hair behind her ear. The gesture was so small, so intimate, an act of gentle care that felt more transgressive and more binding than any contract they could have signed. In that single, feather-light touch, Elara felt the last of her carefully constructed walls dissolve into dust. The choice was no longer hers. She was already lost. The gentle, almost reverent touch of his fingers against her hair was the final devastating blow to her defenses. It was an act of tenderness in a place utterly devoid of it, a single, perfect flower blooming on a battlefield. Elara stood frozen, her entire being consumed by the space where his skin had met hers. The air between them was no longer just tense. It was alive, a humming, vibrant entity charged with years of his loneliness and a lifetime of her repression. He didn't pull his hand away, letting it linger in the space near her temple, a silent admission of a need he could no longer conceal. His carefully constructed world of cold, hard transactions had been breached by this one, simple gesture, and in his eyes she saw the terrifying landscape of a man watching his own fortress crumble from the inside out, powerless to stop it. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a ruin. The smooth, commanding baritone was gone, replaced by a raw, gravelly whisper that seemed torn from the deepest part of him. "He told me you were an angel," Damien rasped, his gaze dropping to her mouth, his words a confession he never intended to make. "I thought if I could own an angel, I could prove they have a price, that they can fall." He wasn't speaking to her anymore, but to the ghost of the man he used to be, the boy who had believed in purity before it was used as a weapon against him. The admission was brutal, selfish, and unbearably sad. He had sought to destroy her innocence not out of cruelty, but to validate his own profound, unending pain. In that moment, he was no longer a monster, but a man drowning in his own history, and he was pulling her under with him. He moved then, erasing the last inch of torturous space between them. His hands came up to cup her face, his touch shockingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence of his confession. His thumbs traced the delicate line of her jaw, a gesture of such profound intimacy it felt more invasive than any physical act. Ilara's breath hitched, her eyes fluttering closed in a moment of pure, involuntary surrender. She was no longer fighting the current, she was letting it take her. The scent of him, clean, cold, and achingly lonely, filled her senses, overwhelming the familiar smell of old paper that had been her shield for so long. She was unmoored, adrift in a sea of sensation she had never known, and the only anchor in the entire world was the warmth of his hands holding her face as if she were something precious, something worth saving. The kiss was not a gentle exploration. It was a desperate, frantic collision. It was the taste of years of solitude, of bitterness, and a deep, unquenchable thirst. His mouth claimed hers with a hunger that was both terrifying and profoundly sorrowful, a raw expression of a need so deep it had starved for years. For Ilara, it was an explosion of sensation in a life lived in shades of gray. The shock of it, the heat, the sheer force of his emotion, short-circuited every rational thought in her mind. This was not the chaste, imagined kiss from the romance novels she mended. This was a raw, primal act of communication, a desperate exchange of two broken souls, a kiss that felt less like a beginning and more like the beautiful, tragic end of everything she had ever been. He pulled her against him, his arms snaking around her waist, molding her soft, yielding form to the hard, unyielding lines of his body. The contact was a jolt, a sudden, shocking awareness of her own physicality and his overwhelming masculine presence. Her hands, which had been clenched at her sides, flew up to his chest, not to push him away but to hold on, to steady herself against the dizzying, terrifying pull of his orbit. All the reasons she was there, the hospital bills, Lily's pale face, her mother's worried frown, dissolved into a mist of pure, undiluted feeling. There was only the solid wall of his chest beneath her palms, the frantic beating of his heart echoing her own, and the dizzying realization that for the first time in her life, she was not giving a piece of herself away in sacrifice, but in a moment of shattering, mutual need. Breaking the kiss, he rested his forehead against hers, his breathing harsh and uneven in the suffocating silence. His eyes were squeezed shut, his face a mask of such profound anguish that it stole her breath. This was his transgression. Not the purchase, not the act he planned to commit, but this moment of connection, this involuntary surrender to an emotion he had sworn off forever. He had brought her here to be an object, a symbol to be conquered, and instead, she had become his mirror, reflecting his own desolate loneliness back at him with blinding intensity. He had failed. He had breached his own defenses. In his desperate attempt to prove that purity could be broken, he had inadvertently allowed a sliver of her light into the deepest, darkest vault of his soul, and it was burning him alive. Without a word, he took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers with a possessiveness that was both a claim and a plea. He led her from the library, their joined hands, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their different worlds. They moved through the sterile perfection of the penthouse, two ghosts on a silent pilgrimage toward an unavoidable fate. The bedroom was a vast, minimalist expanse of gray and white, dominated by a large, unadorned bed. The only decoration was the city itself, a glittering, indifferent tapestry of 1,000,000 lives visible through a floor-to-ceiling glass wall. It was a cold, impersonal stage, a place designed for transactions, not for the delicate, messy business of two souls colliding. The sight of the bed, so stark and final, made the reality of her choice crash down upon her with the force of a physical blow. He released her hand and turned to face her, the city lights creating a stark silhouette of his powerful frame. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of the moment, the finality of the threshold she was about to cross. This was the culmination of all her sacrifice, the absolute end of the girl who lived among books. The immensity of it, the sheer, irreversible scale of what she was giving up, rose in her throat like a scream. All the control, all the quiet strength she had clung to, shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. A single tear escaped, tracing a cold path down her cheek. "Don't do this to me," she whispered, her voice breaking, strangled by a terror that was bigger than her, bigger than him. "It's too big." Her words struck him with an almost physical force. He froze, his expression shifting from pained desire to stark, horrified clarity. He finally understood. It's too big. She wasn't talking about him, about the physical act. She was talking about the universe of love she carried for her sister, the crushing weight of her sacrifice, the immeasurable value of the innocence she was laying at his feet. He saw it all in that moment. The dusty workshop, the sleepless nights, the quiet, relentless erosion of her youth. He had come here seeking to own a concept, and he had instead been faced with the most profound and powerful force in the universe. A human heart willing to shatter itself for love. Her genuine, soul-deep terror exposed the pathetic, selfish nature of his own quest for vengeance against the past. He was not exorcising a demon. He was becoming one. In that instant, the architect of ruin was dismantled. The cold, calculating predator in him died, leaving only the broken, lonely man who had been hiding underneath all along. He didn't step back, nor did he move forward with his original intent. Instead, he closed the small space between them and did something that undid her completely. He gently reached out and, with his thumb, brushed the tear from her cheek, his touch as soft as a whisper. A matching pain bloomed in his own eyes, a reflection of her agony. "I know," he breathed, his voice thick with a lifetime of unshed tears. The words were a surrender, an admission of his own brokenness. The contract between them burned to ash in that shared gaze. The transaction was over. Whatever happened now would not be a purchase, but an act born of two people who had just recognized the profound, devastating loneliness in each other. The silence in the car on the way back was a different kind of silence from the one in his penthouse. It was not the heavy, charged silence of unspoken tension, but the hollow, ringing silence of aftermath. Outside the window, the city was waking up, its colors muted and gray in the pre-dawn light. Ilara watched it pass in a blur, feeling like a foreigner in her own life. The notification on her phone, a cold, digital confirmation of a massive bank transfer, did not bring relief, only a profound sense of nausea. She had not been violated in the way she had braced herself for, but something more fundamental had been taken. She had walked into that glass tower as a girl defined by her sacrifice, and she was leaving as a woman defined by a transaction, the price of her soul now a quantifiable, obscene number on a screen. She slipped back into the apartment like a thief, the key turning soundlessly in the lock. The air inside was still and heavy with sleep, smelling of her mother's lavender-scented cleaning products and the faint, sterile scent of Lily's medications. She tiptoed to her sister's room, pushing the door open a crack. Lily was asleep, her face pale but peaceful in the soft glow of her nightlight, a stark, unbearable symbol of the innocence Ilara had just sold. A wave of love so fierce it felt like a physical blow washed over her, immediately followed by a tidal wave of guilt. The money would save this precious life, but it felt like a poison she was now injecting into the heart of her family. She had protected Lily from the world's ugliness her entire life, only to become that ugliness herself, a secret that would now forever stand between them. Sleep was an impossibility. She retreated to her workshop, the one place on earth that had always felt like a sanctuary. But the familiar scent of old paper and binding glue offered no comfort now. The towering shelves of books, once her silent companions, seemed to judge her, their stories of honor, love, and heroic sacrifice, a mockery of her own sordid bargain. She ran her hand over the embossed leather of a classic romance, but she felt nothing, no connection to the world within its pages. She was a ghost now, haunting the ruins of her own former life. The memory of Damien's touch, not a kiss, not a caress, but the shockingly gentle brush of his thumb against her tear-stained cheek, was the most vivid thing in her mind. It was that single, unexpected act of humanity that had truly broken her, leaving her adrift in a sea of confusion and shame. Miles above the waking city, Damien Blackwood stood before his wall of glass, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. He had not slept. The pristine, silent perfection of his home had become a torture chamber, every hard surface and empty space echoing with her whispered plea. "It's too big." He had sought to purchase and conquer an idea, to prove to the ghost of his past that innocence was a commodity like any other. Instead, he had been confronted by its reality, a force so profound and selfless it had shattered his cynicism and exposed the pathetic, hollow nature of his own pain. He had failed in his objective. He had not broken her. She had broken him. Her fear, her sacrifice, and the single tear he had wiped away had become the new ghosts haunting his sterile fortress, specters of a humanity he had long ago tried to exorcise. The lie was the first payment on a debt that would never be settled. She told her mother it was an anonymous donation, a miracle from a charitable foundation that had heard of Lily's plight. The words felt like shards of glass in her throat. Her mother's reaction was a storm of weeping, gut-wrenching relief, a raw and beautiful display of a mother's love that made Ilara feel like a fraud. Mrs. Vance clutched her, calling her a saint, praising her for her unwavering faith. "I knew your goodness would be rewarded," she sobbed into Ilara's shoulder. Ilara stood rigid in her mother's embrace, the warmth of it feeling like a brand. She was their savior, their miracle worker, and she had to accept their gratitude while knowing she was the architect of a lie that now formed the very foundation of their hope, a lie that isolated her completely. In the days that followed, the apartment was filled with a fragile, unaccustomed lightness. The experimental treatment was scheduled, and for the first time in years the future felt less like a cliff edge and more like a distant horizon. Lily's smiles were more frequent, her mother's humming filled the kitchen, but Ilara felt like she was watching it all from behind a thick pane of glass. She was a participant in their joy, yet entirely separate from it. A chasm had opened between her and the family she had done this to save. They looked at her and saw the same quiet, devoted daughter, but she knew she was irrevocably altered. She had traded a piece of her soul for their happiness, and in doing so, had become a stranger in her own home. Her profound isolation, the terrible, unforeseen cost of their salvation. Damien tried to lose himself in his work, the cold, clean logic of numbers and corporate warfare that had always been his refuge. But the work had lost its meaning. He would stare at financial projections and see the terror in her faded denim eyes. He would sit in boardrooms, surrounded by powerful men, and feel nothing but contempt for their petty ambitions. He had spent his life building an empire of control to insulate himself from the messy, unpredictable world of human emotion. Now, a single, fragile book restorer had breached his defenses and laid waste to his kingdom. He found himself scanning online news articles, searching for any mention of a large, anonymous donation to the city hospital, a desperate, pathetic need to see the tangible result of his actions, to find some proof that the devastation he felt had at least created something good in the world. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift within Ilara. The constant gnawing fear of her powerlessness, the feeling of being a victim of circumstance, began to recede. Walking home from the workshop, she looked at the city not as an oppressive maze, but as a landscape of stories, each person a narrative of their own. She had faced the most terrifying things she could imagine, offering herself to a powerful, cold man, and she had survived. More than that, she had seen the monster and recognized the profound brokenness within him. That knowledge had subtly rewired her. The world no longer seemed so large and intimidating. She had walked through the fire And while she was scarred, she had not been consumed. In the ashes of her old self, a new, resilient strength was beginning to take root, quiet and unyielding. This newfound strength began to manifest in small, almost unconscious acts of defiance. When her mother's anxiety began to spiral, instead of absorbing it silently, Ilara spoke with a calm, gentle firmness that was entirely new, reassuring her without diminishing her own feelings. At work, when a wealthy collector tried to condescend to her, she met his gaze without flinching, her voice steady as she explained the value of her craft, refusing to be intimidated. It was as if the encounter with Damien had burned away her timidity, leaving behind a core of tempered steel. She was no longer just a guardian of other people's stories, content to live in the margins. The fear of what she had done was still a constant companion, but it was now joined by a dawning, terrifying awareness of her own agency, her own power to write the next chapter. Night fell, and in two separate parts of the city, they were alone with the same memory. Damien stood in his silent penthouse, the city lights a cold, glittering carpet below him. He held his phone, his thumb hovering over the broker's contact information, possessed by the overwhelming urge not to use it, but to delete it, to erase the path that had led him to her. In her small workshop, surrounded by the comforting silence of sleeping books, Ilara held an unmended volume in her hands, its pages blank. For the first time, she did not see it as a task to be completed, but as a possibility. They were separated by an impossible gulf of wealth and experience, yet bound by an invisible thread of shared trauma and an unwanted, undeniable spark of mutual recognition. Their transaction was over, but the true, terrifying consequence was just beginning to unfold. Months bled into a season of fragile hope. The experimental treatment worked like a slow, quiet miracle, coaxing the color back into Lily's cheeks and the light back into her eyes. The crushing weight of medical debt was gone, replaced by the quiet, steady hum of a life being rebuilt. Ilara watched this rebirth from a distance she herself had created, a loving ghost in her own family's happiness. She returned to her workshop, but the woman who now held the delicate tools was not the same. The timid, apologetic girl had been replaced by a woman with a core of quiet steel, forged in the silent fire of Damien Blackwood's penthouse. The memory of him was a permanent scar, a place that ached with the changing weather of her emotions, but it was also the source of an unshakable, newfound strength. She had walked into the darkest part of the forest and had, against all odds, found her own way out. One crisp autumn afternoon, a courier arrived, a man in a sharp uniform so out of place in her dusty corner of the city that he seemed like an apparition. He held a large, flat box, wrapped in simple brown paper, bearing her name and address in a stark, typed font. There was no return address, only the impersonal logo of a high-end delivery service. Ilara's heart seized, a frantic, panicked bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, who it was from. Her hands trembled as she signed for it, the pen scratching loudly in the sudden, profound silence of the workshop. She placed the box on her workbench, staring at it as if it were a bomb. It was a piece of his world, of that cold, sterile, glass and steel reality, delivered directly to the heart of her sanctuary. With a deep, steadying breath, she sliced through the tape with her bookbinding knife. Inside, nestled in a bed of soft black foam, lay a book. It was a first edition of a classic tragedy, a story of a flawed hero's fall and his desperate, impossible search for redemption. She recognized it instantly from antique catalogs. It was a volume worth more than her entire workshop, but it was ruined. The leather spine was completely severed, the cover was stained and scarred, and the pages were water-damaged, their edges brittle and curled. It was a magnificent wreck, a beautiful tragic artifact that had been utterly broken. Tucked between the warped front pages was a single, thick piece of cardstock. On it was one typewritten sentence, a stark black island in a sea of pristine white containing no greeting and no signature. The note read, "You restore things. I am told this one is beyond saving." The words landed not as a statement, but as a confession. It was a gauntlet thrown down, a desperate message in a bottle sent from a man stranded on an island of his own making. He wasn't talking about the book. He was sending her a proxy for his own soul, a tangible symbol of the ruin he inhabited, the wreckage he had made of his life. It was an admission of what she had seen in him that night, the profound, irreparable damage hidden beneath the layers of wealth and power. It was not a request for her services, not a transaction to be invoiced. It was a question, the most important one he had ever asked. Is there any hope for something this broken? Can a life, a soul, truly be mended? Ilara sank into her chair, her fingers tracing the deep scars on the book's leather cover. The scent of decay and old paper rose from its pages, a familiar perfume that now mingled with the phantom memory of his cold, clean, lonely scent. She felt the full weight of the choice before her. She could send it back. She could throw it away. She could treat it like any other job, a technical problem to be solved for an anonymous client. Or she could accept it for what it was, the second half of a conversation they had started in that silent, glass-walled room. To mend this book would not be an act of forgiveness, nor would it be a gesture of love. It would be an act of profound, defiant empathy. It would be her answer, sent back to him in the only language they both now understood, the quiet, meticulous language of restoration. The late afternoon sun slanted through the workshop window, illuminating the dancing motes of dust, turning them from the ashes of a life unlived into a swirling galaxy of possibilities. With a surgeon's care, Ilara lifted the broken book and placed it in the center of her workbench. She selected her finest thread, her sharpest needle. She did not know if she would ever see Damian Blackwood again, or what she would say if she did. That was a future yet to be written. But as she made the first careful stitch binding the broken spine together, she knew she was not just mending a book. She was mending the jagged edges of her own past, proving to herself, and to a lonely man in a tower, that nothing, not a book, not a life, not even a soul, is ever truly beyond saving. If this story of an impossible connection has touched you, I invite you to subscribe, like, share, and comment on what you believe the future holds for them.